I'm Dr. David Adams. In this session, we'll be reading the account of God's promise to Abram that accompanies his changing of the name to Abraham in Genesis 17. There's going to be a lot to unpack as we read this passage, so let's jump straight into the text. Verse 1 begins with a temporal clause that establishes the context for the action. Wahi Avram ben Tish'im Shana Watesha Shanim, when Abraham was 99 years old. The verse begins a new episode in the life of Abram by introducing the setting with a temporal clause. The sentence employs the standard way of stating an age in biblical Hebrew by referring to Abram as a son of 90 year and 9 years, meaning, of course, 99 years. I know that sounds odd to our ears, but the use of a singular word for year with numbers greater than 10 and the plural word for year with numbers less than 10 is standard usage in biblical Hebrew. The reason for this development is unclear, but it seems that they treated certain words commonly used with numbers as collectives, hence the singular form. It's one of the challenges of working with the syntax of numbers in biblical Hebrew. In the last verse of chapter 16, we're told that Abraham was 86 years old. So 13 years have passed between the last episode, the flight of Hagar and the birth of Ishmael, and what's about to happen here. You will recall that Abraham resided at several sites in the Negev, primarily in or near Hebron, Beersheba, and Gerar. The last time we heard anything about Abraham's residence back in chapter 14, Abraham was living near the Oaks of Mamre, a traditional way of referring to the area around Hebron. So that's the most likely setting for these events. Vayerar Yahweh el Abram. Yahweh appeared to Abram. The verb is a nifal of ra'ah. This is one of the standard words used to talk about the manifestation of the presence of God. Here the nifal has a reflexive sense, to show oneself, or perhaps a combination of the permissive sense with the passive, to allow oneself to be seen. Most English translations render this either as appear or show oneself. One might also use a gloss that's more functionally oriented, something like revealed himself. The text continues, Vayomer Elau ani El Shaddai. And he said to him, I am El Shaddai. Here God uses an identification clause to talk about the way that he has revealed himself. In biblical Hebrew, identification clauses are commonly formed in this way. There's a pronoun followed by an indicator of identity, usually a noun or a name. Normally, there's no form of the verb to be expressed, and that has to be supplied by the reader. In this case, God identifies himself using the name El Shaddai. This name for God, either El Shaddai or Shaddai by itself, is used 48 times in the Tanakh. But note that of these, 31 are in the book of Job. No other book uses it more than twice, apart from the 6 occurrences in the book of Genesis. So the use of this title in Job is a question that's worthy of further study on its own. Of these 48 instances of the name or title Shaddai, 23 occur in combination with the divine title El, either connected directly with the name, as in El Shaddai, or as an appositive or parallel term in poetry. The use of this name introduces three problems that we could explore more fully if we had time, but we don't have time to explore these issues now. They're often taken up by commentaries, and I encourage you to look at these questions on your own as part of your study of the text. But I do think that we have to at least mention these matters here so that you're aware of them. The first issue is the meaning of the name El Shaddai. Most attempts to answer this try to determine the meaning of the name by looking at the etymology, that is, the history of the words used in the name. One of the most common explanations for the meaning of the name that you hear today connects the Hebrew word Shaddai with the Akkadian, that is, Babylonian and Assyrian word Shadu, that means mountain. So the point would be to highlight God's nature as a mountain God. Those who've advocated this approach have tried to make a big deal out of the idea that Yahweh was originally understood to be a God associated with mountains. Now, the connection of Yahweh with mountains, Mount Seir, Mount Sinai or Horeb, and Mount Zion, and so forth, is obvious enough that it hardly requires any additional comment. But before one rushes to find some profound insight in this, we ought to remember that most of the gods of the ancient Near East were associated with mountains one way or another, even to the point that the Mesopotamians constructed artificial temple mountains. We call them ziggurats. They're essentially a type of step pyramid with a temple on the top, kind of a symbolic mountain abode for the god. So identifying any god with a mountain hardly seems more like stating the obvious rather than like a major theological insight. A more traditional, etymologically oriented explanation connects the name Shaddai with the Hebrew verb shin daleth daleth, shaddad, that means to destroy or devastate or ruin. We also have the related nouns shod and shadada, both referring to destruction. This idea of a God who is powerful enough to destroy all things is probably the derivation that's behind the Septuagint's frequent translation of Shaddai with the Greek word pantokrator, and the Vulgate's translation of omnipotens, both of which give rise to the common English rendering of Almighty. Well, there are a number of other etymological derivations that have been suggested, but we won't try to go into those here. The more important questions are whether the etymology of the name is really all that important at all for understanding its use here. And the answer to that is probably no. As interesting as the etymology of the name might be as an academic exercise, it does not really help us understand the point of its use here. So, the wise exegete learns not to be overly preoccupied with etymology. The second major issue here is what this verse contributes to answering the question of the problem of reconciling Exodus 6:3 and Genesis 4:26. Simply put, the problem is this. In Genesis 4:26, we're told that people began to call upon the name of Yahweh at the time of Enosh, the grandson of Adam and Eve by way of their son Seth. However, in Exodus 6:3, we're told that God appeared to the patriarchs using the name El Shaddai, and that the name Yahweh was not known to the patriarchs. Again, this is a much bigger problem than we have time to deal with here. Indeed, the British scholar Walter Mobley has devoted an entire book to the subject. For classical historical criticism, this was part of the evidence for multiple sources of the Pentateuch. Most traditional biblical interpretation finds an alternative explanation in one of two places. Either the understanding of what it means to be known by a name, beyond the use of a vocabulary word, or in the nature of quoted speech as used in the Tanakh. A third major issue that arises from this is kind of closely related to the second, and that's the overall significance of the use of names formed as compounds of the divine name El in the Tanakh and especially in the Pentateuch. These names seem to fall into at least two different categories. First, there are those that appear to be used as actual names for God. Among these are names like El Elyon, El Roy, El Olam, and, of course, El Shaddai. Then there are those that are formed on the same pattern, but whose pattern of usage suggests that they're not so much names as simply descriptive phrases. These would include formations such as El Bethel, El Elohe Yisrael, El Elohe Avika, or more simply El Avika, and El Gibor, and a few others. All of these are issues around the name. They're significant theological issues that deserve study in depth. However, none of these theological problems are directly connected to the central thought of this particular passage. Here, the God of Abraham simply refers to himself by that name. The theological crux of this passage is made in what follows. Hithalek lefanai v'hyeh tamim. Walk before me and be whole. Here we have two imperatives in sequence, joined by a wow conjunction. The syntactical question is how we should understand this sequence. The most obvious option would be to take these two imperatives as separate instructions, as in do X and then do Y. If we take it that way, then God would be giving Abraham two separate and not necessarily related commands. Walk before me, and second, be tamim. The Hebrew adjective tamim means to be complete, perfect, blameless, or whole. So God would be demanding moral, or at least cultic, perfection of Abram, and by this command, he would be giving him a condition of the covenant relationship. Now, the ESV's translation takes it exactly that way, as two distinct commands. And it makes God's covenant with Abraham in verse 2 conditional on Abram's obeying both of those commands. But a very different understanding of the syntax of this passage is pointed out by Wilhelm Gesenius in his standard classical Hebrew reference grammar. Gesenius writes in paragraph 110f, the imperative in logical dependence upon a preceding imperative, jussive or cohortative, or an interrogative sentence, serves to express the distinct assurance or promise that an action or state will ensue as the certain consequence of a previous action. So especially the imperative when depending with a wow copulative upon another imperative. This, of course, is the situation that we have here. In this case, the first imperative contains, as a rule, a condition, while the second declares the consequence which the fulfillment of the condition will involve. The imperative is used for this declaration since the consequence is, as a matter of fact, intended or desired by the speaker. Now, if we take our text as an example of this use of imperatives joined by a wow, then the point would be that by walking before El Shaddai, Abraham would become, or be regarded by God, as Tamim. This is not just some abstruse grammatical point. This makes a tremendous difference in how we understand the nature of the covenant that God makes with Abram and ultimately with us. You could argue that it goes to the very heart of what the gospel is, and it certainly shapes how you would preach this text. Well, there was a lot to discuss in verse 1. Fortunately, it gets a bit easier from here on, so let's go on to verse 2. V'atena barithi beni ubenecha, and I intend to grant, bestow, a covenant between me and you. As I read this verse, the one thing that shouts out to me for attention is the use of the verb natan to talk about the making of a berith, a covenant. The most common way that the Old Testament talks about making a covenant is with the verb karat. The idiom cut a covenant is used more than 60 times in the Tanakh. The next most common usage, but quite a bit less common, is the use of the verb kum in the Hithiel form hakim and the like. This idiom, typically translated establish a covenant, is used 12 times in the Tanakh. But here we don't have either of those. We have natan, the verb to give. As a careful reader, you should notice this unusual idiom, and it should raise two questions for you. First, how common is this idiom? And second, is there some difference in connotation or meaning between this idiom and the more common ones? To answer the first of these questions, I'm going to use Logos Bible software to do a kind of search that you may not have done before, a clause search. I'm going to use a clause search because my goal is to find all of the verses that have a verb lemma, that is a word used as a verb lemma of natan, and which also have an object lemma, that is a word used as an object of the verb, of berith. And the Logos clause search allows me not only to search for words, but to search for words that perform specific functions within a clause. So here in Logos, I've opened a search window, and I'm going to select clause from the search option. Since I'm assuming that you haven't done this before, I'm going to walk through it one step at a time. First, I'll search for all the verses that have natan as a verb. So I type VERB-LEMMA colon nun tau final nun. And I run it, and here are my results. Now, for the second part, here I only want these verses that also have berith as an object. So I add to what I already have in the search window, and in all capital letters so that Logos knows it's a command, object lemma, colon, and then I type the word berith in Hebrew. The only catch to this is that you have to learn how to use the Hebrew keyboard layout that you have installed on your computer, which frankly you should do anyway. When I perform that search, I get 7 hits. But here's where you have to be careful. What I asked for in the search was all the verbs that have natan as a verb and berith as an object. But that doesn't mean that berith is necessarily the object of the verb natan. It's also catching every verse that has natan as a verb and berith as an object, regardless whether berith is the object of the verb natan or whether it's the object of some other verb. So when I look at these 7 examples, I find that only 2 of these meet the criteria that I'm really looking for. Berith as the object of the verb natan. Those would be Genesis 17:2, our verse, and Numbers 25:12. So this is my starting point. But to double check my findings, I also want to do a broader search for all the verses where natan and berith occur together in the same verse. For this, I use a morph search, and this produces quite a few more results, most of which are irrelevant for what we're looking for. But looking at these in more detail, I find 3 more examples that are interesting. In Genesis 9, verse 12, God gives the rainbow as the sign of the covenant that he is nataning with the world. This one didn't show up on my clause search because technically the construct chain sign of the covenant is the object of the verb natan. So the software regards sign as the grammatical object of the verb. But logically, the sign represents the covenant, and that's what God is ultimately giving. So I would definitely count that as a 3rd example of this usage of natan with berith. Finally, there are 2 verses in Isaiah, 42:6 and 49:8, where God says that he will give his servant as a covenant to the people. In these 2 verses, the servant, you, is the object of the verb natan. But the servant is equated with the covenant. So these are interesting conceptually, but they're not quite as close to the grammatical form that I'm looking for. So while they're close and while they're interesting, I'm not going to count them in my results. So I think we can say that there are 3 and only 3 places in the entire Old Testament where we really have this idiom, to give a covenant. So you may be inclined to ask, so what? It's a fair question. And that really is my second question. Is there some difference in connotation, some difference in meaning between this idiom and the more common ones? To understand the significance of the choice of words used here, it's necessary to know a little bit more about covenants in general. In the most basic sense, a covenant is a relationship. The relationship created by a covenant might be political, it might be economic, or it might be personal. Whatever the case, the relationship that is created by the covenant is usually defined in formal, usually legal terms. It might be, for example, the relationship between a king and his vassal. It might be the relationship between business partners or between parties to a marriage. Scholars have tended to characterize these relationships, or to put it in other terms, to describe these covenants in one of 3 ways. Some covenants are what is most often called a royal grant variety. In this type of arrangement, one party, most often a king, in the examples that have survived and come down to us, makes an outright gift of something, typically land or a change of social status, to another party. In this type of covenant, there's no specification of what the recipient must do in return. The second type of covenant is what is commonly known as a suzerainty treaty. This is an arrangement between unequal partners, say a king and one of his vassals, in which both parties undertake some commitment, generally specified by the superior party. So, for example, the king might grant rulership of a certain territory to an underling in return for the regular payment of tribute. In this kind of covenant, the responsibilities of each party, while they're determined by the greater party, are outlined in the agreement. The third kind of covenant is a contract between equals. An example of this might be a bill of sale, in which the goods to be sold are specified by one party and the amount to be paid is specified by the other party. Here also, the obligations of each party are spelled out in the agreement. The point is this: the choice of the word natan suggests that we should understand this covenant as what we characterized above as a royal grant, a no strings attached free gift from a greater party to a lesser party. In this case, the gift is not control of territory, but a special relationship. Now, if you're an astute reader of the Bible, you might think at this point, this cannot be a royal grant type covenant, because there is an obligation imposed upon Abraham and his descendants, the obligation of circumcision. But here too, the choice of words in the text is important. Circumcision is described in the text not as an obligation to be met by the contracting party, but as a sign. That is to say, an outward symbol. Think of it like this. In our culture, the legal relationship or covenant that we call marriage is most often accompanied by the wedding ring. But the wearing of a wedding ring is not a legal obligation that's necessary for the marriage to be legally binding. It's merely an outward symbol of the relationship that the marriage covenant has established. This is how circumcision is described in the portion of the text that our reading omits. It's an outward sign of the willingness of the receiving party, Abraham and his descendants, to live in the relationship that God's free gift establishes. You remember back in verse 1, I said that I was going to take the second of those two imperatives as the expected result of the first action rather than as a distinct command. Hopefully you can see now why I believe the choice of wording impacts our understanding of the theological significance of the actions described in our text. And in turn, that can help us understand how to process the grammatical options related to those imperatives in verse 1. So, Abraham walks before God as one who is tamim, whole, right, or perfect, because God has given to him and to his heirs a special status as his people through this covenant relationship. And that makes this very much a promise of the gospel rather than a demand of the law. And the choice of words here is vital to the meaning that God is communicating to Abram about the nature of that covenant relationship. That it's God's free gift, not something that Abraham or Israel or we can earn. In the last clause of this verse, God adds a further blessing to that gospel promise. Va'erbe otika b'ma'od me'od, and I intend to increase you exceedingly. Two quick observations here. First, the verb form, wa'erbe, is a hiphil imperfect of the root resh beth he, rava. In the call, this root is intransitive, so it means to be many or to increase or multiply, usually in number, but occasionally in some other quality or aspect. But in the hiphil, which is much more common, this root is transitive. Transitive verbs are verbs that transfer their action to an object. So it means to increase something or someone else. Again, most commonly in number or amount, but occasionally in some other quality or aspect. The verb form itself could be either an indicative, a statement of fact, or it could be a cohortative, an expression of will or intention. With third he verbs, the forms are identical. I've chosen to read this as a cohortative, since the context suggests to me that this is less of a statement of fact than a statement of what God intends to do as part of the blessing that Abram will receive in this covenant relationship. If you prefer to read it as an indicative, then you would render it something like, and I will increase you exceedingly. The second observation refers to the phrase b'ma'od ma'od. Here, the preposition base is used to introduce an adverbial phrase. It tells how God will increase Abraham. The word ma'od is really a noun used with the sense of strength, but in practice, it's mostly used in an adverbial way, to do something strongly. So the most common gloss for this word in English is very. Hebrew uses repetition as a way of expressing what we would call degree. Now, we do this occasionally in English as well, as when you might say to your spouse, I really, really love you. And that's the usage here. So we could render this clause, I intend to really, really increase you, or I intend to increase you a whole lot. But I've rendered it a little more formally as I intend to increase you exceedingly. Verse 3 is comprised of two clauses, and the only real issue here is how we understand the relationship between those clauses. So let's read the whole verse first. Vayipol Avram al panai, and Abram fell on his face. Vaydaber ito Elohim lemor, and God spoke with him as follows. The act of falling on one's face refers to doing obeisance, bowing down and touching one's forehead to the ground. In the ancient world, this act was a way of speaking about expressing respect or awe or submission, or when it comes to God, a posture of worship. The syntactical question here is whether the first clause, the falling on his face, is a response to what happened just before it, or whether it's the context for what happens after it. Remember, the wow simply joins the clauses together. It doesn't tell you how they're joined. So if we took this statement as a response to what went before it, we might render it as a consequential clause and say something like this. I will grant a covenant between me and you, and I intend to increase you exceedingly. So Abraham fell on his face. That is, Abram's act of obeisance is Abram's response to what God said to him. But If we take this as to the context for what follows, we might read it as a temporal or circumstantial clause, something like this. I will grant a covenant between me and you, and I intend to increase you exceedingly. When Abraham fell on his face, God spoke to him as follows. Now, either of these readings is grammatically defensible. It's a matter of how you understand, as the reader, the connection that's implied by the conjunction wow. As I said before, the wow simply joins the clauses together. It doesn't tell you how they're joined. You have to arrive at a conclusion about how they're joined by considering the context. And in this case, that means analyzing the flow of ideas in the discourse. Verse 4 is also comprised of two clauses. The first is a statement, and the second, a clarification of the nature of the covenant mentioned in the first. So together, these two clauses create a single thought in which the nature of the promise that flows from this relationship is defined. Ani hine barithi itika. For my part, this is my covenant with you. The initial pronoun, ani, is slightly emphatic in the sense that it shifts the attention of the hearer from what Abram did in the previous verse to what God, as the speaker and primary actor, is doing. Here's the case of where the word hine should not be translated with the first-year Hebrew gloss, behold. Remember, hine is a focalizing particle. That is, its basic function is to focus the attention of the hearer or reader on something. In this case, it does this by emphasizing the fact that follows. And the fact that follows is the clarification of the nature of the promise that God is giving. So here, a rendering like, this is a more appropriate gloss than behold. This is my covenant with you. Or perhaps even more clearly, this is the nature of my covenant with you, would be a better translation. V'hayitha la'av chamon goyim, that you will become a father of a crowd of nations. Here the wow introduces an explanatory clause. The nature of the covenant promise is explained. The explanation is expressed through a name change in the form of a pun whose explanation communicates the nature of the promise. Abram, the honored or exalted father, becomes Abraham, the honored father of a crowd, because he will become a hamon of nations. This is not an etymological explanation. It's a phonological pun, a sound-based play on words. The choice of the word hamon is not based so much on its meaning as on the sound value of the word. And oh, by the way, the word hamon is itself onomatopoeic. By onomatopoeic, we mean that the meaning of the word is related to or derived from the sound of the word. We have words like this in English, words like hiss or clink. The sound is the meaning. In the case of the Hebrew, hamon suggests the sound of a hum, the sort of low, rumbling background sound that you hear when you walk into a room in which a crowd of people are all talking at once. So the lexicon gives a gloss something like tumult or commotion or a noise, especially the kind of noise made by a group. So by extension, the word comes to represent the group of people who make the noise. Hence, lexicons give glosses like crowd or multitude. So, street level rendering of this clause might be something like, you will become the father of a whole bunch of nations. Verse 5 basically completes the thought that was begun in the last verse. You will become the father of a whole bunch of nations. V'lo yikare od simcha Avram, so that your name will not be called Abram anymore. Here the wow introduces a result clause. The result of Abraham's becoming a father of a whole bunch of nations is that he will no longer be called Avram, an exalted or honored father, but will be called Avraham, the exalted or honored father of a bunch. As the next clause puts it in Hebrew, Wahaya Simcha Avraham, but your name will be Abraham, Ki Avhamon Goyim Natatika, because I will give you a crowd or bunch of nations. Notice the repetition of the word Natan here. By the way, if we include the verses of this passage that are omitted in our liturgical reading, the verb Natan is used 5 times in this passage. That's no accident. Its use highlights the significance of the use of Natan in that unusual idiom of the giving of the covenant that we observed back in verse 2. This is God's free and gracious gift to Abraham. Through and in him, God will fulfill the promise of the restoration of the fecundity or fruitfulness of creation. Ultimately, this leads to Jesus as the descendant of Abraham, through whom all the nations of the earth, that great crowd of nations that will gather before the throne of God, will be invited into the restored kingdom of God. Verses 6 and 7 together further repeat and expound upon the promise that God has made in verses 4 and 5. Wahiprethi otka b'mod b'mod, and I will make you exceedingly fruitful. The only thing here that we need to note is the choice of the verb para. The verb is a hiphil wow consecutive perfect first common singular of the root pe, resh, he. As with the verb rava that we had above, the verb is intransitive in the call and transitive in the hiphil. So in the call, it refers to someone or something being fruitful. The common noun pre, fruit, is related to this verb, as probably is the name of the tribe Ephraim, the fruitful ones. Anyway, in the hiphil, the verb has the idea of making something or someone fruitful. Nafatika lagoyim, and I will make you into nations. In this clause, we have the verb natan used for the 3rd time. Here, note the use of the preposition lamed with the verb. This is essentially the same use of lamed that we often have with the verb haya. Grammarians would call this something like the lamed of product. The point is that this lamed is used in idioms with verbs of making or doing to indicate what something will become or be turned into. So the phrase, I will give you into nations, means I will make you or turn you into nations. Umalakim mimka yetzeu, so that kings will come from you. Here, the wow is resultative. By that we mean it introduces a clause in which the outcome or result of the previous action is indicated. The result of God's bringing into existence many nations through Abraham is that the rulers of those nations, kings, will also come from him. Verse 7, together with verse 8, which emphasizes the giving of the land, but which we will be omitting today, conclude God's side of the relationship that he's establishing with Abram. This serves as a summary of what's been said. V'hakimoti eth berithi beni ubeneka. So I will establish my covenant between me and you. There are two things to observe here. First, the wow here serves to introduce a summarizing conclusion to what has been said up to this point. So I would render it as thus, or so, or perhaps something somewhat more expansive like, so in this way. Second, note that here we have the verb cum used in the Hithiel rather than the use of natan that we noted earlier. This underscores the summary nature of the clause. And more significantly, it makes an important theological point. God establishes his covenant by giving these things to Abraham. Again, this word choice highlights the nature of the relationship. It is God's free gift, not something that Abraham earns. Ubein za'aka acharecha l'dorotham, and between your progeny after you for generations to come. The gift that God gives in these promises is for Abraham, but not for Abraham alone. It's all about his descendants. It extends through him to generations to come. The last word, the Dorotham, speaks to the issue of how long this promise will last. It will last to their generations, meaning as long as the generations of Abraham's descendants last. This is the basis of the appositive phrase that follows, the berith olam, as a perpetual covenant. The relationship established here will be an enduring relationship, one that lasts perpetually. So it's called a berith olam, a perpetual covenant. This phrase is used 12 times in the Tanakh, always to emphasize the intended permanence of the relationship between God and his people. I say intended permanence because while God will never withdraw that relationship, the gifts and calling of God are irrevocable, as St. Paul observes in Romans 11:29. It can be broken from the human side. The people of God can violate that relationship and so break the covenant and fall under God's wrath, as Isaiah observes in Isaiah chapter 24, verses 5 to 6. When that happens, the promise of God has not failed. The promise remains a promise to all who receive it in faith. What has failed is the human side of that relationship. But because the promise remains in force, there is always, even for those who've rejected the promise, the possibility of repentance and a return to that relationship. And it's the nature of that relationship that is the point of the last phrase in this verse. L'hioth laka Elohim v'zarecha acharecha, to become your God and the God of your progeny after you. This is a shorter version of what will eventually become the quintessential statement of the covenant relationship. I will be your God and you will be my people. That definition of the covenant relationship is stated or alluded to in one form or another around 30 times in the Tanakh. And this, by the way, is the first time in the Tanakh that this relationship is described in this manner, even though we have it here in an incomplete form. The full expression of this definition occurs for the first time in Exodus 6, verse 7. Our liturgical reading skips to verse 15. Between verse 9 and verse 15, we get a description of what the people will do in this relationship. But since that's not part of our liturgical reading, we'll skip down to pick up the account in verse 15. Vayomer Elohim el Abraham, then God said to Abraham, Sarai ishtaka lo tikare eth sima Sarai. As for Sarah, your wife, you must not call her name Sarai. God's discourse with Abraham begins by introducing a new subject to be discussed. It does this by fronting the subject. And fronting the subject in this way is a common rhetorical practice in Hebrew prose when a new subject is introduced. In this way, God introduces the third party, Sarah, to this matter. That this introduces a new section is clear if we look at these fronted subjects. God started by saying what he himself would do with the ani of verse 4. Then the discourse moves to what the people will do with the wa'ata of verse 9, which we didn't read. And now the implications for the third party to this promise are introduced with the Sarai ishtaka of verse 15. So you can see how this rhetorical device serves to structure the discourse. Here the verb is a negative, second person indicative form, lo tikra. The context is instructional. God is giving instructions to Abraham. So in this context, it makes sense to take this as a negative imperative. That is, a long-term prohibition. Do not call her name Sarai. One could also read this as a negative modal imperfect and render it something like, you must not call her name Sarai. Ki Sarah Shema, because Sarah is her name. There are probably two things to note here. First, the name doesn't really change. Both forms are essentially the same name in Hebrew. Remember in biblical Hebrew that verbs that were once upon a time third yod have become third hey. And essentially we have the same kind of thing happening here. A third yod form has become a third hey form. So the only thing that actually changes here is the spelling. It's really the same word, and it's typically translated princess. The word in both of its forms is a feminine of the noun sar. That noun is commonly translated prince, although that's a bit misleading. A sar does not have to be the son of a king or even a member of the royal family. The noun sar often designates the holder of an administrative office, something like an official or a governor. And sometimes it simply designates a person as having a certain social status, like we might use the word Mr. or Sir. And the feminine form is also used to indicate a woman of a certain social status, a lady, if you will. By the way, this is the use when the Bible says of Solomon that he had 700 wives who were princesses. Now, there aren't that many royal households in the ancient Near East in the region of Israel at that time. So what this verse is saying is about the social standing of the women as ladies, not a statement that they were daughters of kings. Well, the recognition that the name doesn't really change except for its spelling leads to the second thing that we should note here. This is one of the few places in the book of Genesis where we get the naming of, or a change in the name of a significant character, where we do not have the kind of naming pun that we had earlier with Abraham. It seems that the most likely explanation for this phenomenon is that we don't get a pun for the change of name here because the name doesn't really change. Only the spelling has changed, if you will. The last verse in our reading for today completes the thought regarding Sarah. Uberakti otah, and I will bless her. Wagam nathati memena laka ben, and also I will give to you a son by her. The point of the also here is that Abraham will have a son by her, just as he has already had a son by Hagar. Waberaktiha wahayatha lagoyim, and I will bless her so that she will become nations. Malkei amim memena yehu, and kings of peoples will come from her. Here at the end of verse 16, we have an intriguing textual problem. The Masoretic text has the feminine forms. I will bless her. She will become nations, and kings will come from her. But the Septuagint, the Syriac, and the Vulgate all read this using masculine pronouns, referring to Isaac rather than Sarah herself. I will bless him so that he will become nations, and kings will come from him. Now, this is clearly not accidental. You may argue that it doesn't really matter in the end, since these things happen through Sarah's son, and since he comes from her, then logically, they too will ultimately come through her as well. But that misses the point of textual criticism. The point of textual criticism is not to smooth out the theological ideas. The point of textual criticism is to determine the correct reading. And I would regard this example as about a 50-50 proposition. There's really no way to determine which way the text should be read. The fact that the Septuagint, the Syriac, and the Vulgate all read the masculine probably implies that there was a version of the Hebrew text that read the masculine as well, even if that version of the Hebrew text has not survived to our day. For what it's worth, the editors of BHS and many commentary writers prefer the masculine reading. And the reason for that is that the blessings associated with the covenant relationship are always spoken of as being passed down through the male line of descendants. Probably the strongest argument in favor of the feminine reading that the BHS has here is that the subject under discussion in verse 15 through verse 17 is Sarah, not Isaac. Isaac doesn't become the subject of the discussion until verse 19, and the promises spoken here are essentially attached to Isaac in that verse. So it wouldn't make a lot of sense to have them stated here. You will, of course, decide for yourself what you think that the correct reading is. I'm inclined to retain the feminine forms despite the fact, and in some ways because of the fact, that they're so unusual and distinctive. In my view, the shift from feminine to masculine is much easier to explain than the other way around. It might have been either as an intentional change to make this text match others where the promise is descended through the male line, or it may have been just an accidental change that happened because the scribe is just so accustomed to to hearing these promises in a masculine form. There's really no way to be certain. Either way, it's easier to see how the feminine forms could be mistakenly transformed into masculine forms than it is to see how masculine forms could be accidentally transformed into feminine forms. The central theological issue in the text before us is how you understand the syntactical relationship between the two imperatives in verse 1. How you answer that question will determine whether you understand this passage as fundamentally a law text or fundamentally a gospel text. I've indicated that I disagree with how the ESV renders it. The ESV's rendering of two imperatives as two distinct commands makes this passage fundamentally a law text in which God demands perfection from Abraham as a condition of the covenant. I have agreed instead with the understanding reflected in Gesenius's grammar, and I take the second imperative as the expected or intended outcome of the first imperative. And that makes this text fundamentally a gospel text, in which Abram's status before God is not the result of Abram's ability to be perfect, but is God's gracious gift of a relationship with him. This, I've suggested, is further emphasized in the text by that unusual idiom to give a covenant in verse 2, and then by the repetition of the verb natan, to give, throughout the passage as well. So this is a good example of a text in which grammatical and syntactical insights in the original language can shape how one preaches this text. I've argued that both the grammar and the word choice focuses the text on the free gift of the relationship that God gives to Abraham and to us who are Abram's heirs by faith in Jesus Christ. I'm Dr. David Adams. Thank you for joining me as we've read Genesis 17, verses 1 to 7 and 15 through 16 together. And I hope you'll join me again soon for another opportunity to read the Word of God together in the language in which He inspired it to be written. Until then, shalom in Jesus.